At the report, it's an independent, obviously, Oxfam, showing that the richest 1% of the world will own more than 99% combined by 2016. I mean, this is just, it's ludicrous if one thinks about that.
It's completely unsustainable.
Yeah.
And what we've seen is that since the 1980s, an unfettered rise of the market, which was meant to be a distributor of resources and income. But instead what we see is the concentration, the growing concentration within the hands of a few, as the report says. And within South Africa, we have not only income inequalities, but inequality skewed by race, skewed by gender and spatial location.
Yeah.
If you look at the 2010 Income and Expenditure Survey, the average household income for a household headed by a black African was 85,000, whereas for the same year, a household headed by a white South African had an income of 423,000. So, I mean, it's almost impossible to compare them, to believe it's the same country.
Yeah.
Again, households headed by women in South Africa have less than 50% of the income than those headed by men. And our inequality is growing exponentially as well.
Yeah. Let's talk about the drivers of inequality. What leads us to a situation where the graph literally goes from here to here and nothing in between?
In South Africa, it's linked predominantly to unemployment and to the question of wage differentials. What we've seen over the last 10 years is a slight amelioration of the poverty people in the lowest 3 income deciles as a result specifically of social grant income. But then the richest 10% their incomes have shot up. So it's basically, if you have access to a job, you have a better guarantee of not being quite so poor. But then again, as I was talking about the wage differentials, 2 years ago, the average income for a worker in the formal sector was only 2,500 rand.
Yeah.
So that's basically part of the working poor. And that comes down to some of the questions around the national minimum wage that are being debated in NEDLAC in Parliament.
Yeah. I mean, we see Statistics South Africa just releasing figures showing that since 2010, our poverty rate has increased. It was at 20%. Now, figures showing 21.5%. You know, it's not getting better. It is getting worse, and we need to step in. I mean, what do we need to do? Obviously, it's job creation.
Job creation, but I think we also need to stop this us and them. There's a big preponderancy amongst the middle classes and elites in South Africa to talk about poverty as being somebody else's problem. It's all of our problem. We need to look at questions of our progressive tax system, although it is progressive. We believe, a number of us, that there's a possibility and a space to increase taxation amongst the wealthier. We need to look at distributing income to people in the lower echelons as well. Unless you have demand from the bottom up, you're not going to kickstart this economy because then you concentrate the demand in the hands of too few who generally go for imported luxury goods as opposed to stimulating local production, bread making, brick making. So it's about looking at changing the whole idea. In '94, just after the RDP was introduced, we had this idea of growth through redistribution, and then come 1996 with GEAR, that was changed to redistribution through growth. The problem that we have is that when you don't have the growth, you don't have that redistribution, and so you do not begin to dismantle the structural nature of our inequality.
Let's have a look at this graph that we've got here, because this is it's quite interesting to have a look at the disparity between men and women and, you know, the other segments of the population. Talk us through this.
As you say, what's we've seen generally, and especially in the developing countries, is that formal sector workers tend to be largely male. These are people who go in as a career, sort of at early career, and continue to work. Because women generally carry a lot of the burden for social reproduction, they're not able to have such formal careers. And so you have women shifting in and out, formal, informal. Own account operators, predominantly in South Africa, are female, and there's a huge level of vulnerability. We're just doing some work in Everton, working with micro-entrepreneurs. And the level of vulnerability and the ability for the entire household to sink back into poverty as a result of, for instance, protest action, strike action, your entire livelihood is then undermined for that.
Yeah. Just finally, and I think something that really needs to be spoken about is that you look at every story in the news right now, we keep talking about service delivery protests, we keep looking at the events that are taking place in almost every sector of our society, and when you look at it, it is service delivery, it's poverty, it's job creation. These are the things that are at the heart of the concerns of South Africa. It's a ticking time bomb, if one has to look at it this way, especially between the rich and the poor.
I mean, Zwelinziva Vavi of Cosatu 2 years ago spoke about the ring of fire that's growing. And I think there's a danger of calling some of these protests service delivery protests because, as you say, it's actually the hurtful nature of people saying, we've lived with this for 20 years, we've been given promises, and things are not changing. That the youth, the unemployed rate amongst the youth, and the fact that young people have got very little to hope for, because without hope you don't build a future. You aren't invested in making the solution happen. So I think you're right, Leanne. It's about how we stop and look at things differently. Yeah. We've had the rhetoric from government for the last few years that it's not business as usual. But when it comes down to talking about poverty and inequality, it seems that nobody wants to really tackle the thorny issues, those within government. So we would encourage, with the new budget coming out after the State of the Nation, for National Treasury and government to really take some bold and decisive steps, not only in order to rein in the inequality, but also to show the message to people who are living in poverty on a daily basis that there is something that can be done and that their voices are being listened to and heard.
Okay, thank you for talking to us. If anybody wants to get their hands on a copy of this, the results and survey, where can we go? Is it downloadable?
Yes, from the Stats SA website, and then the Oxfam report on the Oxfam website.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, Isobel. Thank you very much for talking to us here on the programme. Isobel Frye, the Director of Studies in Poverty and Inequality Institute, talking to us about poverty levels here in South Africa, and certainly that growing gap between those that have and those that do not have.